Yo, what's going on, Time Clan? It is your boy King Tynex here, back with another video, and you guys already know the deal. This is going to be what if Issei was the son of Anubis. Now, this is going to be an interesting what if, considering the fact that, well, we are dealing with Egyptian gods in this what if, and I get to explore like a whole another lore that I kind of basically can create in a way. Yeah, in a way, I can basically create my own lore for this series. And as you guys can probably figure, Neptune did help me when it came on to the planning of how this would go. So if you guys are interested in Neptune's lore content, be sure to check the link in the description. I have the link to her Wattpad in the description. Anyways, let's get with the video. Let's get on with the video. To say that Issei's life was anything but normal was an understatement. You see, being the son of an Egyptian god, let alone the Egyptian god of death himself, Anubis, or at least in some versions, many people seem to have variations of who was necessarily the god of death in Egyptian mythology. But when it came on to Issei, he didn't really focus that much on it. He figured that his father had control over certain aspects of death, especially when it came on to the embalming process for the dead as well. When it came on to Issei, he was meant to take over the mantle of his father one day, just like his father did as well. When it came on to Osiris, Anubis was eventually the one to take over the role of being the god of death. When it came on to Issei, he was meant to be the one to take over when he became an adult as well, when he became of age to take over the throne in a sense. And because of this, Issei ended up having to become mature, you could say, at an earlier age. His father made sure to instruct Issei on how to act, how to do this, do that. He would learn many things from his father over the years, learning how to manage the dead, learn how to use his powers, his magnificent powers in his own opinion. And Issei, as I've said before, he would learn to behave more properly, you could say. He would act more accordingly in terms of how somebody who had control over the dead should act. He was not necessarily brash, but he wasn't the most calm person in the world still. He was still a teenager, or at least in terms of Egyptian lifespans, you could say a teenager, and therefore Issei still had a lot of learning to go through. He still had a lot to learn, even though he was coming closer to adulthood by the day, or well, year. Issei figured that he would just live most of his life in Egypt though. He would continue to learn from his father, gain all of these studies from his father, and just go on to take over the mantle one day. But his comfortable life in Egypt would be interrupted one day. Issei would be confused. What exactly did his father want with him today? He thought it was going to be one of his days where he actually had a break from studying on how life worked. But apparently, his father had something different in mind. His father, Anubis, explained that there was some sort of situation happening in Japan when it came on to the different mythologies, these different factions, more so focused in the Christian and Catholic realm of factions, you could say, which left Issei in curiosity. He didn't really hear that much about the other factions. Sure, he knew that they existed, but he figured that they were their very own domain. That wasn't necessarily something that he needed to get involved with, ever. But apparently his father mentioned that normally it would be the case that he should not get involved, but in this case the magic was fluctuating. The factions, they were becoming a bit too involved in human affairs. His father wanted Issei to go check it out. He wanted to see if he was overreacting or not. He didn't want to snoop in personally. If Anubis of all people, or well, beings, were to go all the way to Japan, a lot of people would notice that, but when it came on to Issei, he was still a minor god in the sense. Issei still had a lot of growth to go through, and therefore, when going to Japan wouldn't really bat an eye in most of the factions' opinion, or like, I phrase that pretty terribly. Basically, Issei wouldn't really be seen as much of a threat in many other factions' eyes. Therefore, they wouldn't really bat an eye when it came onto Issei going over to Japan to check it out. Sure, he was an Egyptian god, but there wasn't really much that he was controlling over just yet. He still hadn't set up a name for himself as of yet. As for his father Anubis, he's been here for far longer. He's been there since the Holy Wars, the Great Faction War, all of these wars. He's been around for eons essentially. So he already set up his own position. He set up his title in the world. Now it was time for Issei to go check out what's happening on the other side. Especially since when it came onto Egypt, there wasn't really much going on, and if Issei was going to become the next heir to the throne, well, he was going to have to get more experience, outside experience you could say, dealing with people from the outside. Learn how these people react, learn how they talk, learn how all of these different people react to different situations. Basically get a feel for what humanity is like. Issei was a god, but that didn't necessarily mean that he had to completely detach himself from humanity. Issei needed to learn some form of humility after all. If he just stayed cooped up in the afterlife, or like the underworld, well no, just afterlife, then he would never gain an understanding for what humanity was really like. And that was an important call when it came on to judging the hearts of humans as well. Issei would be annoyed, but he would listen to his father in the end, especially considering how his father was leagues above him in terms of strength and abilities. And his father was eons wiser than Issei would ever be. At least for now anyways. He was, of course, still a teenager, while his father, well, you get the point. Issei would be enrolled into a cool academy in which he would just learn about the people. He would be more of an observant person, you could say, rather than being a pervert like his usual self, always trying to peek into girls' locker rooms. Issei in this version, he wasn't really interested in that. He just wanted to go back home. He was honestly pretty annoyed with how most people reacted. Some people, they were often just too loud and brash for his liking. But Issei, he would still try to keep a cool head for the most part. That was until he met a crimson-haired girl with green eyes, and she also had a friend with jet black hair. Their names were Rias and Akano. Just by looking at them, Issei would already know that these girls were different from the rest. They had a different aura to them. He would have realized right then and there that they were devils. They were pretty obvious in his opinion. Their energy was practically leaking out when it came on to Issei's sensing abilities. Issei just tisked, considering how easy it was for him to just discover them. When it came on to Sona Citri, At the very least, it took him a little longer to figure out that she was a devil. He did not necessarily look at her the same as Rias and Akino. Basically, when it came on to Sona, she was harder to get a grasp for. Rias and Akino, they exerted their devil's energy in a less conspicuous way, or inconspicuous. Basically, it's like this. Sona had an easier time controlling her devil's energy. She kept it more concealed than Rias and Akino, although they weren't necessarily all that aware of it. Issei was able to tell it from a mile away. Issei would just call them out for it as well. Rias and Akino, they would actually be surprised to find that Issei was able to figure out that they were devils, and this would immediately put them on high alert. How did this kid know about their true identities? Issei would go on to explain that it was pretty obvious their energy was practically leaking out of them. They needed to do a better job, in all honesty, at keeping their energy concealed. Sure, they were in a human realm in which most humans are not able to really sense energy like that or see that sort of energy either, but there are some that would probably be able to find it. There are some powerful humans out there he is aware of. He's heard of some powerful humans throughout history, and they were not necessarily the fondest of devils either, meaning that if they weren't careful, they could get themselves killed. Rias would question who exactly Issei was. How was he able to sense them? Was he like one of those humans or something? Was he like a magician? Issei would kind of snort hearing this. No, I'm not necessarily a human, Issei would say. I'm more like what you guys would consider to be, well, an angel, or like, in this case, you can call me a god. I am the Egyptian god Issei. Issei would, well, explain. Issei would also explain that when it came on to him, he was more so focused on the aspects of death when it came on to the Egyptians, which intrigued Rias to an extent. She was curious now. If Issei was an Egyptian god who had control over the aspects of death, would that mean that he could maybe help her in this situation of hers? Rias would go on to actually ask Issei if he could help her. He would be offered a great amount of items, from riches to women, all of those sorts. Issei would just laugh at all of Rias's offers just to get Issei's help. Issei would explain to Rias that he already had plenty of that stuff. He had control over the dead. Pretty much every pharaoh is under his control, essentially. Every pharaoh throughout history, their wealth belonged to Issei. Well, it belonged to his father, but you get the point. Every Egyptian that's ever died, every Egyptian's money basically belonged to Issei and the rest of the gods. But when it came onto the sands as well, if any sort of gold would have fallen into the sand, or any gold that lay in the sands, that belonged to Issei, and that meant the sand throughout all of time, all of the gold throughout history that's ever been fought with or fought for in wars Many people who have died in the sands and in the sandy dunes of Egypt. Basically, anybody who's ever died in war from diseases, any sort, especially if they died in the sands. They belong to Issei. All of their wealth belonged to Issei's family. So of course he had no concern when it came on to money. Every pharaoh's wealth belonged to Issei. So why would he be concerned about how much money that Rias could give him when it came on to other things like women? Issei did not really care about that. Sure, he may be interested in women to a certain extent, but not to the point where you could just be bribing him with them. That was ridiculous in Issei's opinion. Rias would explain why she even wanted Issei's help in the first place. That being, of course, that she wanted to get out of this arranged marriage between her and this Riser Phoenix guy from the Phoenix clan. Apparently, her family and the Phoenix clan family also, well, not also, but the two families decided to work out an agreement. They wanted to produce more naturally born devils into the world. Strong devils at that, and by having two of the strongest clans, the Grimoire clan and the Phoenix clan, basically come together and have kin with each other, that could create for an ultimate weapon of sorts. Very powerful offspring. Although it would probably take a while, considering how, when it came out to devils, they seemed to have a harsher time when it came on to, well, trying to reproduce. It was as if most of the time they were infertile or whatever. It basically took longer for them to get pregnant. Issei would listen to Rias' story and he would understand where she was coming from. He understood that from his time in Egypt, he'd seen many arranged marriages, and not all of them were always that pretty. Some of them ended up with the wives being depressed. Sometimes the husbands, they were abusive, or it could be the other way around at times, where the wife was abusive to the husband, and that led to the husband deciding to just end it all. Sometimes the husband would lose his sanity because of this woman. Although this man would usually be disrespected by his fellow peers afterwards. Even after he died, when they heard the news, they would just laugh and mock him for it, just allowing his woman to walk all over him. In that sort of society, it was a pretty cruel society at times, but Issei had to admit that it just seemed to be a norm within many societies at this point that women were always seen as lesser than men. They were seen as a weaker of the two, which was not necessarily wrong, but at the same time, and it basically meant that women were fragile while men were supposed to be the tough people out there. As for Rias now, it seemed as if she was embodying the very same thing. She was on the more fragile side. That's why she could not just necessarily fight her way out of the marriage. At least, that's what he thought at first. Until Rias mentioned that she would be willing to do practically anything to get out of this marriage, even if it meant that she had to fight Riser to the death or something along those lines. She would be willing to do it. Issei would listen to her and he would explain something to her. He would explain that right now she seems to be fairly weak. Even Issei, while he was a child, was probably stronger than Rias at this age. Rias felt offended, but Issei would continue. He would explain that he's not necessarily allowed to interfere in these sort of affairs. or at least directly get involved in these sort of affairs. The best that he could probably do is to maybe train up Rias with some of his dead soldiers. That's probably something that he would be allowed to do. Rias would think about it for a minute. Train with dead soldiers. That was a bit odd, but Issei would explain further. He would explain the whole purpose of training with his dead soldiers would be to build up her combat skills, and since these soldiers were already dead, she did not necessarily have to hold back. He could make these soldiers regenerate. He could make these soldiers come back every single time, so long as he had the mana, you could say, or the energy. If he was willing to do it, any of that sort, he could have them come back each and every time. He could even bring Rias and her group to, well, his domain. His domain being the afterlife, the Egyptian afterlife, where she could fight entire armies just so that she could become stronger. Well, he probably wasn't going to do that. She needed to offer him something extremely valuable if he were to send her to his domain just so that she could train. But for right now, he would be willing to help her as just a token of good faith. He wanted to build connections with these new, not really new, but with these, well, different factions. He wanted to build these connections so that they would be on good terms for later on in the future. Rias would think about it for a minute until she decided that she would be willing to take the offer. It seemed like an offer that was too good to be true, and it really just depended on what she was willing to do in the end, if she was willing to put in that sort of effort. Issei would smile hearing that she accepted his offer. He wasn't going to be light on her training whatsoever. Or at least, yeah, he was not going to necessarily be light on her training. It was more so what Rias wanted in the end. If she was really that desperate to get out of this arranged marriage, then she would put in all the effort possible. Rias would go on to confront her brother and demand that she be taken out of this arranged marriage. If she had to fight Riza in a rating game, then so be it. Sir Zex would listen to his little sister and he would shrug. If she wanted to get out of this marriage so badly, then so be it. He would have a rating game arranged for a month from there on. And of course, Rias would have her whole group go to one of her many estates, you could say. This would be for training purposes. Issei would supply Rias with some of his undead soldiers. They were skeletons, but they were strong skeletons, you could say. He basically reinforced their strength, their speed, their durability, all so that they would be good training dummies for Rias's group. A whole month would pass with these guys constantly fighting this group of undead soldiers. Issei would have easily been able to keep it up to where they would not necessarily disappear. They would, anytime the soldiers ever were struck enough to where they would begin to turn to dust, he would just have them be reformed. Every time they broke down, he would reform them just like that. They would be fixed and they would be good to go. Right more. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that every time these skeleton soldiers were defeated, they would just regenerate. They would come back and fight once more. Every single time, they would not necessarily give Rias's group that much of a break. As long as Rias's group approached them, they would go on to fight each other. That was basically it. But Rias after a time, got lazy. She figured that she was strong enough after a certain point, rather than trying to use that full month to, well, fight the skeleton soldiers. She eventually decided to give it a break. She figured that she deserved to give her group a rest from fighting these soldiers that Issei also graciously set up for her. The whole plan was for them to fight the soldiers every single day and night, for a whole month straight, gaining combat skills and abilities so that they will be ready for their rating game eventually. But Rias ended up becoming too cocky, and she would learn the hard way. This hard way being, of course, when she had to go on and eventually fight Riser Phoenix's peerage. And although they were stronger in this timeline, well, Rias still ended up losing. It was a hard fought battle, but even Rias wasn't able to stand up to Riser in the end. Riser was just too strong, or more so, his regeneration was too strong, his healing flames, all of that sort. The Phoenix's clan's ability was just too overwhelming for the Remery peerage, and of course, Rias would be forced to marry Riser in the end, although she was greatly annoyed by it. Issei would hear the news one day and he wouldn't be all that surprised. He could tell that Rias had begun to wane off on her training. She was meant to train for that whole month, but after a time Issei was realizing that his soldiers, they weren't in need of regenerating as much. As a matter of fact, days would have gone by where he just felt his soldiers not really doing anything. They were just standing around, just watching, waiting for Rias's group to approach them. But of course, Rias's group, they would just stay away from the soldiers after a time. The only one that really walked up to the soldiers would be, well, Kiba, in order to strengthen his sword skills, which Issei could respect. He could see through his dead soldiers' eyes as well. He had that ability, so he was able to see everything that Rias's group was doing for a time, and you would have just face palmed. They were basically wasting such a great opportunity, so it wouldn't be of any shock to Issei to find out that Rias's group ended up losing in the end to the Riser Phoenix peerage. That's what happens when you get cocky in this world. That's what happens when you become too easygoing, you could say. Bad things happen. That's something that his father taught him from a very young age. Never become comfortable. Always try to pursue more in life. Never become comfortable, never become stationary. If you become stationary, then that means that you are no longer living, essentially. You're just letting the elements take over. The only time you should ever be stationary, the only time you should ever be comfortable, the only time you should ever stop moving is when you're dead. And they have incredibly long lifespans. They're pretty much immortal, so unless you were killed, don't ever stop moving. And unfortunately, that's exactly what Rias did, so she paid the consequences. The consequences, of course, being getting married to Riser Phoenix. And Issei wasn't the type of guy to get all that mixed in with family affairs either, so he would have just left the situation there. Issei would now focus on himself more. He would have been, well, not necessarily himself, but more so the culture of Japan. He would have been interested in finding out more about the cultural differences between Japan and Egypt. And to his shock, it was very different. Well, not really to his shock. He wasn't really that surprised to find out that they were radically different cultures, but he was intrigued. He was intrigued to find out more about this culture. So intrigued though that he would end up noticing like energy spikes as well. And he would be curious about that as well. He would be curious about all of Japan at this point. He would realize that there were yokai in this land. He would realize that there were angels, fallen angels, and devils as well, all around just Japan itself. He wondered why that was the case, but he wouldn't really question it that much. Instead, he would be questioning more so the energy spikes. Every now and then, he would realize that there were large gaps of energy, or like large increases of energy, spiritual energy, and then it would immediately drop right after. He would be questioning why that was the case, and he would even go on to investigate one day. Following the energy spikes, he would be led to an area where it was practically filled with cult members. A bunch of people were wearing these cloaks, or like robes, which concealed their faces, and Issei would continue to feel the energy spikes, and he would just immediately go in. He would just take down most of these members. Most of these guys are wearing these cloaks, these robes. They would be pretty much easy for Issei to take down. Issei would have realized that these guys would have been a problem, but he didn't necessarily kill them. He just knocked them all unconscious. He would walk into the area. He would walk into the building, more so, I should say. And he would go on to explore just what exactly was happening. He would follow the energy spikes, and he would get closer and closer. The more closer he got, the more he felt the energy spikes, and eventually he would find his way all the way down to a secluded area at the very bottom of the building. It seemed to be underground actually, and Issei would have realized right then and there what exactly was going on. Apparently, there was some fallen angels here, and they were trying to extract something. They were trying to extract a blonde girl's sacred gear. It seemed as if they were extracting sacred gears from a lot of people actually. The last one that seemed to be extracted was a red gauntlet for whatever reason. Issei would have realized right then and there that these guys needed to be stopped. These guys are probably rogue fallen angels, and therefore he had free domain to kill these guys. He had free domain to get involved because they weren't necessarily connected to the fallen angel faction whatsoever. So with this now being made aware to Issei, he would go on to attack these guys, and he would pretty much mollywop every last one of them. I'm gonna be 100% honest. These guys were small fry for Issei. Issei, he would have created a skeletal sword, you could say. Or not necessarily a skeletal sword. More so, just a sword made out of bones that he would have created from, well, one of his many undead soldiers. And this sword, he would imbue it with life energy as well. Or not life energy, the opposite of life energy. It would be death energy, you could say. He would be imbuing it with his own aura, and with this aura, it would be a deathly aura that even the fallen angels could feel, and they would begin to get sick from it actually. They would become nauseous when in close proximity of Issei. Issei would just use this opportunity in order to slash each and every last one of them to pieces. And the interesting thing about, well, Egyptian gods like Issei was that if they killed you, regardless of if you were a fallen angel, a Norse god, any of those things, it didn't matter what exactly you were. You could be Opus for crying out loud. But if they killed you, you would be sent to the Egyptian afterlife. Not your own, their own, the Egyptian afterlife, where Anubis would be the one to basically tell what your fate would be at that point. Issei would immediately contact his father and explain the whole situation to him, why these three fallen angels were in his domain all of a sudden. And after hearing the news, Anubis would understand where Issei was coming from. He was glad that his son also informed him as well. It really did seem like the lessons were really getting through to his son now. He was glad to see that his teachings were really showing in Issei and his development and how he acted in this different realm, this whole new world, you could say. Now it was time to judge these fallen angels. Issei would have disconnected from his father, or well, he would not necessarily pay attention to what the fates of these angels would be. He pretty much already knew what it was going to be just from their actions earlier. But Issei would go on to untie the blonde girl. She would explain that her name was Asya and she was glad that he had saved her, because it felt like her life energy was literally being drained out of her, which Issei would explain that she wasn't very far off from that explanation that she just gave him. That was pretty much what was happening already. She wasn't far off in believing that, to be honest, because they were trying to take away her sacred gear, which in a sense was her life energy. You take away the sacred gear and you take away the person's life. Asya would be horrified hearing this, and she would give her own backstory as well. Well, after they got to really know each other, Issei would ask her where she wanted to go, and she would explain that she really had nowhere to be, because the fallen angels were the ones to basically take her in. She thought that they would be the ones to help her in restoring her relationship with God, the biblical God, to be more specific. Issei would hear this and he would just frown. These fallen angels were trying to manipulate Asya, and from the seams of it, she seemed like a pretty pure girl. Finding out that she had nowhere to go either made Issei pretty upset. This girl's basically used this whole entire time, and now that they finally had no use for her anymore, they tried to take away her life, take away her sacred gear. Issei just found that to be unacceptable, unredeemable, as a matter of fact. He was hoping that these guys got the worst punishment ever, but knowing his father, he probably wasn't too concerned about that. He would just try to act impartial for the most part. Issei still had a bit of a temper at times, although he hated to admit it. Issei, knowing that Asya had nowhere to go, to offer her a home of sorts. You see, Issei was basically renting out a place, or well, not really renting out a place. Basically, thanks to his amazing, family wealth. His family wealth extending for like generations at this point, he was able to supply himself with a pretty nice place in Japan to stay at for a good while. And of course, he would offer up a room to Asya. He had a lot of rooms, he just never really used much of them. As a matter of fact, he pretty much just slept on the couch most of the time. So Asya could just sleep in one of the rooms and he wouldn't even really know that she was there. Asya would cheer hearing this and she would accept it. She would accept this opportunity because, well, she really had nowhere else to go. And hearing this from Issei, the person who had just saved her, would make it even better in her opinion. This would essentially be the start of a new relationship of sorts. Over time, Asya would get to know more about Issei, and she would begin to admire him the more and more that she learned about him, eventually to the point where she would even try to offer herself as a servant to Issei. She wanted to help in his endeavors after all, and if she could become a servant, well, that would mean she could become even closer to Issei as well. She wanted to be of some use to Issei after all of the help that he brought towards her. He had literally saved her life and gave her a roof over her head as well. Gave her a home, and she even was provided food as well. Food, shelter, life, all of these things Issei basically offered her, and she felt like a freeloader at times. She didn't want to feel like that. She wanted to be of use to Issei, like I've said before. So offering herself as a servant to Issei was her natural conclusion. Over time, Issei would question whether she really wanted to be his servant or not, but she would insist on becoming one. So Issei would do exactly that. He would put his sort of seal on Asya's neck, and it would also cause for her clothes to shift to be more so that of an Egyptian woman's, like a belly dancer, you could say. And Asya would also notice that her strength felt, well, let me repeat this. Basically, she felt stronger in a way. She felt better. She felt stronger than she had ever been just by becoming Issei's servant. And Issei would explain the whole issue of becoming a servant of an Egyptian god. Basically, they gained some of the Egyptian god's powers. Now, which kind of power? Well, that was entirely dependent on, well, their personality, their moveset, all of that. The Egyptian god, basically, Issei didn't really have control over what sort of power that Asya got. It was pretty much random. It pretty much just relied on what sort of person they already were, and therefore, Asya's ability was, well, death manipulation to an extent. She had her healing abilities, well, enhanced, but she also gained control over death to an extent. Not necessarily to where she could summon soldiers or anything, but she would find that she could, well, use her healing abilities in the opposite direction. Rather than heal a person, she could basically cause that person to decay. She could cause that person's body to rot from the inside out, and therefore she could kill that person just by a single touch, which was terrifying, but she would make sure to use that power into great use in order to serve Issei well. But she would not be the only one of her servants to come. She would only be the first of many. And this is basically where I'm going to end part 1 for now. You guys already know the deal. If you guys like the video, maybe hit that like button. If you guys been rocking my content for a little while, maybe hit that subscribe button. And maybe, well, leave a comment. And if you guys know anybody who may be interested in this sort of content as well, you guys already know the deal. Maybe hit that share button and, well, share it with a couple friends who may be interested and watching this sort of content. But beyond that, that's all I got to say. Time Clan is your boy King Time. Next signing out. Peace.